and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Cove. I'm the host of the Cove podcast, but today we're doing a Cove talk. So the topic today is the potential operating environment and what it demands of junior leaders, what part junior leaders play in Army's mission. I'm joined today by two guests. First is DCA, the Deputy Chief of Army, Major General Chris Smith. Welcome, sir. My second guest is the Regimental Sergeant Major Army, Warrant Officer Kim Felmingham. Welcome. Perfect. So before we start, I think it's important, and we've done this throughout the day, so the important thing is this is a culmination of today's activities, which is the Junior Leaders Fellowship. We're at the end of day one and the culmination of today. The first thing we're going to do is I'm going to throw to you, sir, straight away, to talk about, I suppose, the really difficult task in a few moments of distinguishing what sort of defines the next conflict as opposed to the past. What does it look like that we're going to go into that sort of context?
So just put it into context, I suppose we've just spent an hour talking about the circumstances in Afghanistan. We spent then the next hour talking about the very particular details of the experience of four of us in Rwanda. Both of those contexts are very, very different, but I think you picked up that in those, the basics of leadership, in particular junior leadership, are largely the same. So let me put it into context now for something that hasn't happened yet, and we imagine. And I'm going to try and keep this as short as I can, but you all know that the big feature of the Army's role for the ADF in the next war is littoral movement, to move ourselves between islands, but long-range precision fires, particularly anti-ship systems. The big idea there is that if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, in the Houthis in the Red Sea, you can see that even with fairly expedient primitive systems, the Ukrainians, for example, have been able to destroy about a third of the Russian Black Sea fleet. The Russians are too scared to bring the other 2/3 out. The Houthis, in their attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, are probably giving the US Navy its most intense sort of combat experience since World War II. That might be an overstatement, but I've heard it said. And then if you look at what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, there's a stabilised front where if everything can be seen and can be destroyed, and neither side can concentrate enough force in sufficient numbers to be able to penetrate through the other's fortifications, so they're making very minor gains for the loss of great numbers of life. That's the sort of big context of warfare. The implication for us is that if you're the defender, you get a great advantage, and the big thing for the Army is in all domain warfare, is to be able to achieve sea denial or sea control from the land. I could talk about that to some degree, but I won't. But the implication of it all is that if the advantage in modern warfare is to the defender to such an extent, and if that advantage is particularly great from the land to the sea, then possessing and controlling the bits of land in our region from which you can exercise sea control could have decisive tactical and strategic benefits. The implication for us is that it's easy to imagine us fighting passively or defensively and just stringing missiles out and jobs done. But if the bits of land are so important and owning the best ones, then there is the potential that our enemy will get the jump on us, and that we need to be able to fight to wrest control of those pieces of land from them. So the implication is that while that advantage is great and the challenge of moving across the sea for an army is great, we still have to fight. And that fighting, notwithstanding these days it might include drones and some other things, but if what's happening in Ukraine or Gaza or our fighting against ISIS is an example, it's probably going to look something like the fighting that the Australian Army did against the Japanese in the Second World War on the north coast of New Guinea, or in Bougainville, or probably most particularly Borneo. And that will be fighting through prepared positions. These days it would be reinforced concrete bunkers. as the lessons are coming out of recent war. Land warfare is fought underground or from underground. So that's probably what it'll look like. The implication is that like World War II, that was a bunch of very small tactical fights led by junior leaders, combinations of engineers and tanks and infantry, reducing one bunker after another. And behind that, to make that work, the great efforts of signallers to maintain communications, all of the logistics effort to move stuff over single routes that are constantly under attack by the enemy. It is what we're potentially imagining, particularly in the jungle and the difficult terrain to Australia's north, is really a junior leaders fight. And it will require sort of the qualities and it'll involve sort of the challenges and the horrors that you heard us describe in those previous wars on a scale much greater than probably what we had described to you in the last two periods. So if I'm trying to drill from the high point down to the particulars, for all of that strategic and technical context, the role of junior leaders is just the same, if not more challenging in what we expect it comes next.
That complexity and the change in the potential operating environment being in the Pacific, taking lessons from conflicts we've seen overseas, but then not drawing direct comparisons because we're going into an environment that we can't just directly translate that to.
Quite right.
RSM, if we talk, so we've talked about what it's going to look like and we're trying to predict the future basically, but if we then go to what we need, what do we need of junior leaders, including myself, in the current, like in the next fight?
I think for all of, as DCA described, the need for us to be experts in the land domain when it comes to high-end warfighting skills, from there we can pivot. That is what our goal should be in the training environment. What hasn't changed, and we've had some fantastic discussions up to this point. What hasn't changed is the role of leaders in our army. At the section commander level, that's the only level where soldiers actually command. But what is just as important as we move through our ranks is our ability to enable command. And that's the officer continuum that you're all well aware of. So they are just as important, and having that understanding of your leadership skills, that role is never going to change despite what AO we might find ourselves in. The other thing that hasn't changed is everyone that wears this uniform is a leader, and it starts from leading oneself, and it goes all the way through relative to the AO and the rank that you wear. Management is also a requirement of a leader, and also training is a requirement of everyone that wears rank. We need to make sure that we are setting the right sets of training requirements and outputs to make sure that our teams are as good as they can be, because whilst we've described what war might look like, our next war, we need to be able to have our teams ready regardless of what that might look like.
I want to touch on resilience first though. The chief tasked the current audience, and for those watching at home, the current audience is the Junior Leaders Fellowship. Tasked the current audience, who are the junior leaders of the ADF, to build resilience in their sections. During Mornos and lunch, I spoke to a few different section commanders, and some of them identified that they're feeling the hurt with new diggers that have had way less experience in training command, which leads to a lack of resilience, whether perceived or actual. First, I want to talk about what is resilience, and then subsequently, how do we, as junior leaders, build it in our troops?
We spoke before. In fact, Warrant Officer Brian Buskell spoke about being stoic in the fight. You know, on the battlefield, in contact, there's no safe space. You can't put up your hand in that moment as the leader. Everybody is suffering, everybody is scared. knowing what to do next is difficult to know. Part of leading in that circumstance is to be able to control your own emotions and to some extent your own fear, because others are depending on you. That's a fact. It's something we can't walk away from. And I think when we spoke about it, we said there's no safe space on the battlefield. You can't sort of hold your hand up saying this is getting too much and walk away, because the mission depends on you being there and the team depends on you. You can't let the rest of the team down. And particularly as a leader, you can't sort of pull out and hand over to somebody else. The team depends on you. That's a hard truth. But we spoke also about the fact that when you come out of the fight, you have an obligation to make sure that you are still ready to go back into the fight and return to it. Not for your own sake, but because the war depends on it, but your team depends on it. You can't leave them in the lurch. So just like you have an obligation to get your equipment fixed and ready to go back into the fight, you have an obligation to get yourself ready. And if self-help is insufficient to get yourself ready, then you need to turn to others, all right? So there is a role. Keeping those two things in context is very, very important. The other thing, and I'll be frank, I don't think the Army has done this well for a very long time, if ever. During the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, we had battle smart and so on that helps individuals ground themselves, breathing techniques and so on to deal with the moment when you are fearful, you are close to death, you're under fire, to ground yourself so you can do the things that I just described. But what we didn't do is really prepare ourselves for the challenges of being exposed to that moment, coming out of it, knowing what to do to get yourself fixed and ready so you can go back in and fight again the next day and the next day and the next day. Remembering that either like the stories we were telling before about the very difficult circumstances after the Caballo massacre or during in Rwanda, or whether it's just in a fight, you've lost half of your section, but you've been ordered, hey, we need to get back in the fight, the situation demands it the next day, you need to have the wherewithal to do it. I don't think we've done very well at preparing ourselves or our troops for that circumstance. You know, the question obviously comes out of concern that we've shortened courses or there's maybe aspects missing in training. Well, I can tell you that we're restoring it, and it comes from the idea that human beings are anti-fragile. That goes for bones. You know that bones that aren't used become weak and powdery and break easy. Bones that are used, running and the actual use makes them tougher. Trees that are exposed to hard winds are tougher than trees that aren't. There's in psychology, the same is true for the mind to a point. But it only works. Exposure to trauma is never a good thing, or events that cause trauma. But how you respond to it, your mindset can cause you either to suffer long term or to come out of the experience and actually grow from it and become more resilient when you're exposed to difficult circumstances again. And I think you got an example from the guys that were sitting here earlier of people that grew and were much stronger from very difficult experience than suffered. And the truth is, the stats are that most human beings, having been exposed to some traumatic circumstance, come back stronger from it, not problematic. Just trying to keep it short. We're trying to introduce into training the mechanisms that help us deal with the aftermath of the event in a way that our soldiers will grow from the experience, not suffer a lifelong trauma. Now, let's be clear on that. That's an effort to get a tendency towards that. Everybody has a breaking point. That's not to suggest somebody who's suffering is failing in some way, but the Army owes it to you and to our troops to do whatever we can to make sure you're best prepared for what is a very difficult circumstance. And you know, you got a sense from me that maybe we didn't do that very well for a long time, but we're certainly investing in it now, if that's helpful.
But that's the trying to return it to training command now. Obviously, that will have a lagging impact, I suppose. Yeah. But from your perspective, RSM, how do the junior NCOs in the audience right now, and anyone who's sort of watching, how do they get after that sort of building resilience in soldiers that they perceive they are receiving that haven't had that sort of difficult times in training command, or whatever it may be?
It shouldn't be any surprise that that's not an unusual question that I get asked when I travel around and do battlefield circulation with the chief. I think there's an expectation or a misunderstanding that resilience is binary, and you do a course or something happens and I've got resilience. This is something that an individual has to work to improve or to build, I would say, for the rest of your life. And you're not going to know what that resilience level looks like until you're in the face of adversity. So when it comes to resilience, I encourage everyone to step outside of your comfort zone. We talk about the levels of resilience and the lack thereof with different generations. I don't necessarily subscribe to that because I know our training system works. And as leaders, as NCOs in this organisation, we've got to provide opportunity to build and make sure that everything that we do in training is going to build the ability for our people to be resilient. I was just at the Sub 1 for Warrant Officer course on Friday, and I'm very thankful to the team at LWC for reintroducing the high jump and the OBS course. And there were people on that course that found it extremely challenging to do those two activities. Some people will find it easy, some people will find it difficult. It's about understanding your teams and applying that pressure. We have to survive the next fight, the next war, not just survive the next exercise. And I think there's also a bit of a mindset there. The last point I'll make is that we don't teach and learn just in our training establishments. Units in Army are training establishments, just not by name. And I go back to my first point about leaders. As NCOs, it is your job to train our soldiers, same as sailors and aviators, so that they are ready to step up and take on your role in the future.
And can I just pick up on what the RSM was saying there? So hardship and shared hardship are fundamental to that, and exposure to fear. And both of those things are aspects that we're trying to reintroduce, well, not reintroduce, but get a stronger flavour back into our training than what we might have had. I was at the Defence Intelligence School 2 weeks ago, and just as an example, they're reintroducing a field phase into the course, and that field phase is probably less about doing the intelligence staff work in a CP as a learning for what it's like on the job, but it's as much, if not more, about the stuff that they're doing outside, maintaining pickets, digging in, setting up wire, doing clearing patrols and so on. A deliberate exposure to very little sleep, getting tired, pushing people to that sort of emotional edge, so you get to learn what you're like when you're tired, when things get hard. You learn how to help others go through the same experience when they're tired and things are getting tough. You learn how your character starts to change in those circumstances, but also fear. So we haven't got to the conclusion, but I know that a couple of courses already done it, which is to put adventurous training with the purpose of inducing fear, so that you learn, your first experience of fear shouldn't be in contact, so that you get to learn how you respond to fear, how to deal with it, how to see how others respond to fear, how to help them through the circumstance, but then to do it on subject courses so that you get to learn how to lead while you are also fearful. This is part of the sort of addressing this particular concern that I think the person asking the question was getting after.
I think the difference, so you're talking about needs versus wants, sort of like when you step into a junior leadership role and you're starting to shift from what sort of I want as an individual or what the soldiers want as individuals and more so what they need. You talked before in your example about Rwanda, and many of the panellists did as well, about not knowing that you were going to go. It's a common thread. East Timor was the same thing. It was deploying into Timor Leste in Interfet in 99. No one had any idea. They had 3RAR had rolled into their unit gym, and then by sort of that afternoon they're in Tyndall. So I think how do you get after those things and make those tough decisions that you've now practiced for years about what soldiers need and what we need versus what we want?
I think you're getting, correct me Todd, but you're getting there at the idea of that it's very easy. It's the idea of soda fountain morale. It's very easy to satisfy your troops and to make them happy. You can knock them off earlier generally than everybody else, for example. When there is some hardship to be exposed to, maybe you think it's in their interests to avoid it somehow and find a pathway around it, and thanks very much, boss. There's a whole bunch of other things you can do. But ask yourself the question, when that's all fine until the day that you're about to go to war and it's unexpected. If there's a difference between your section where you've actually trained a bit harder, you weren't up to standard, so you kept everybody around for another couple of hours because you weren't going to leave until you get that thing right. That when you had some scope to introduce a bit of extra training, you introduced an element of hardship to it, so you could test and everybody could see and measure each other and go, hey, I know where so-and-so's weakness is and I can compensate for that when things get tough, or you've got a sense of how everybody deals with hardship and so on. In that moment, the leader that's done that, their section will go to war with a degree of confidence in you as the leader, but in each other because they've been exposed to something. If you've been Mr. or Mrs. Soda Fountain Morale and you've been very popular, but you've sort of got around the difficulty of imposing hardship and so on, in that moment, I can guarantee you who they'd prefer to have as their boss. It's the other section commander, because effectively you've let them down. And interestingly, there's a paper, if you're interested, written by three, I think they were all artillery regiment, British Army COs, who after a few months working on staffs or close to the problem in Ukraine, wrote this paper or back to themselves, their previous CO selves, admonishing themselves for their failure of leading in the battalion, in their regiment, because they said that they had not adequately prepared their troops for the kind of thing that they were watching in Ukraine. And they said that they'd wasted ample opportunity, they'd let their troops down, and they were admonishing their failures as leaders because they hadn't put their troops through sufficient hardship to prepare them for what they were seeing in Ukraine, as an example.
In RSM, needs versus wants.
I'd be interested, and I won't ask the question, but we thrive in an environment where everyone in Army is a soldier first, regardless of ECN. But my question would be, how many people have read the Manual for Army Employment when it comes to all core soldier skills? It exists. It's not a new document. And everyone here in this audience and online should understand what those requirements are, both in the officer and the soldier space. They are clear. But I would argue there's probably a large percentage that have never read the document. It describes what a soldier and officer has to do in the all-core space. We are soldiers first. It's indisputable. And, we talked about being able to survive. In today's operating environment and what we think the next war we might be up against when it comes to capabilities, if we can't survive first contact, your ECN or employment spec is not worth the paper it's written on. So we have to go back to basics. We have to go back to foundational warfighting skills. And you heard some of those examples before on why it is so important when we don't know what that next AO might be or what we are up against.
I think it touches on resilience and then a touch of readiness, but we might come back to that. I think if we talk to trust now, we had a sergeant brief who just deployed on Op Kudu, talking about the need that he had to be confident and trust the trainees would do the 1%ers so that he could sort of and I'm paraphrasing, he could sort of concentrate on what he needed to achieve and the training outcomes that he needed to set. I think if we use that as a point for trust, it's not so much about, his examples were blousing and weapon drills and all that sort of stuff. It's not so much about the act itself, but to be able to trust both your section and the trainees that you are teaching. I suppose if we use that for trust, how can we look at what does trust build, our trust in subordinates and trainees before we get to the higher organisation and our trust in that?
You've all heard the Chief's strategic priorities, and trust is the centre. Without it, we won't succeed as a military. When we talk about trust and we talk about mission command, I think where we have seen a reduction, certainly over the last decade or so, is part of mission command is actually checking. And there were some great examples in that brief of why it's important to check. And it's not because you're necessarily undermining, but you've got to build that trust. And if you don't know where people are taking shortcuts or what orders or training people are bringing in what I describe as normalisation of deviance, we will then get to the point of catastrophic failure. And we have done that. We have had soldiers killed, aviators and also sailors killed because normalisation of deviance has reached catastrophic failure, and that is a waste of life. So don't think for 1 second you checking, owning your responsibilities of command or enabling command is ever going to be the wrong thing to do. You need to be able to speak to your supervisors and put your hand on your heart that your teams are ready, whatever that team might look like. And the only way you can do that is by checking. There is this like a ship piece versus leadership, but that's not going to win the fight. And it will be catastrophic. The Chief talked about where we've got it wrong as a country. In the lead up to World War I and World War II, we were not ready. They were not necessarily wars of our choice. And the catastrophic failure is reflected by the names on the War Memorial.
Yeah, I think trust is a human thing, so I can't compel, you to trust that person and vice versa. We all know this. Trust is developed over time and it's a function of you proving worthy. There's probably 2 parts to it. You've got to prove that you're competent in the thing that you're being entrusted to do. And particularly if your life's on the line, I need to know that you're competent such that if I'm depending on you to shoot straight to make a bound, I need to know that you can do so. That's trust. And the other part of trust is character. I need to know that when the chips are down, that you're not going to, in one sense, I suppose, like the prisoner's dilemma, you're not going to dob me in, or if we're prisoners of war, you're not going to offer information to the guards while I'm holding true to what I'm supposed to, and you're getting privileges and I'm getting punishment. We rely on each other. That's character. That's taking it for your mate, or it's I need to trust that you have the courage to expose yourself to fire in order to drag me back to safety, to patch my leg that's missing or something. Trust is a serious thing, and we ought not give it lightly, and it should not be expected lightly. I mean, we spoke earlier about this, but I do worry that in our mission command doctrine that sort of human complexity and nuance of trust, we don't address it adequately. And there's almost a perception that you can't have mission command without trust, therefore you must give trust. And if a commander isn't trusting immediately, even though it may not be earned, that's problematic, and then you'll be called a micromanager, and heaven forbid, there's nothing worse. My point here is that trust is a very, very human thing. It has to be earned, you have to be worthy of it, and you ought not give trust carelessly. And then even when you're with your most trusted partners, if we're really tight, and you saw how tight some of the guys were on the stage before, you know that you will check each other when you need to be checked because you're all fallible. And that's the example of the buddy checks in things like, for everything we do, but the great examples of buddy checks are what pilots do before they're about to fly a helicopter, or your paratroopers do before you jump out of a plane. We all check each other. So trust is important to that extent, but it's not a trivial throwaway line. There's a lot to it.
Yeah, that's 3 excellent questions, and I could keep going for sure, on especially trust upwards, but we might come back to that. So what I want to do now is give you the opportunity to ask some questions, so I'll come back to the audience. But there's a number of awesome questions throughout the day. Does anyone have any right now? Yep.
Corporal Lawrence, 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. Can you clarify deterrence through denial in terms of Army's contribution to the next theatre of war and projection of power with what we have now if conflict is to arise in the short term? Is Army to defence of the homeland or fit for purpose to deploy to the archipelago of the Pacific? And as such, how can we best prepare or focus our teams in line with our mission to fight and win the next war?
Yep. There are 2 large schools of deterrence. One is by punishment, and that is that I'll hold, for example, nuclear weapons over your head. So if you do something, I will punish you, and the consequence of the punishment so much that I'm deterred from acting. All right, that's nuclear deterrence 101. Denial is the idea that I will defend the thing that the adversary might intend as an objective, and I'm capable of defending it such that your enemy doubts whether they can succeed because of your posture and your capability and your will to defend the objective. There's a little part to that too, which is there's 2 parts to it. That your enemy might think that they will fail in the objective, therefore why go through with it? Because we're arrayed in a way that we give them the impression that they're going to fail in their mission. And the other part is that they might think, well, I might succeed, but what it would take to succeed and the cost to me would be such that it's just not worth it. So denial is those second 2 parts. It needs to be then taken into context. So I can't imagine in a fictitious circumstance that the ADF is going to deny too many global objectives if for some odd reason NATO, for example, ever decided to challenge us. You know what I mean? If taken in a pure on-paper context. But you need to put these circumstances into context, and if the objective that you're seeking to denial relates to protection of Australia or its interests or those of its allies, then you need to factor into your equation that you might be fighting alongside an ally like the United States, which changes the dynamics, or you might be fighting an adversary who's operating from such a long distance from their mainland. And there's other factors going on that the amount of force that they could use in this circumstance gives you actually a relative advantage. Now that kind of idea of relative advantage goes to the Vietnam War, for example. On paper, the Viet Cong and NVA versus the United States will be a clear loser, but context matters. In all of the domestic circumstance, the distance and the kind of war made an enormous difference. What I'm saying is, you take all of those potentials into account, and I can't talk specifics because of it's now unclassified. then actually with what we've got, there's a reasonable chance of denying objectives and putting the idea into a potential enemy that they would fail or it's not worth their while. But that's very particular. The truth is that we're not as capable as we ought to be, and that's clear. The government said so, which is why they initiated the process of the DSR, where Smith and Houston came out the back end and said, hey, we're not fit for purpose, there's some serious flaws, and we're correcting them. But you would quite rightly point out that some of that's taking a very long time. But the intent is there, mate, and without going into particular circumstances, there are some things we can do, but I suspect you identify, and it's probably fair to say, given that we've got a national defence strategy to fix some of this, there are things that probably some gaps we need to fix. Does that answer your question?
Can I just add to that? You know, deterrence is actually in the eye of the adversary as to whether they're deterred or not. You heard, once again, some examples of operational experience from the previous briefs. And I often hear about, soldiers, sailors and aviators join the military and they want to deploy. I really don't think we've amplified or contextualised what it is to deploy for the 21st century, because we are doing that now. And I'll speak on behalf of Army. We've got, and I understand the means that we're on, a significant amount of soldiers overseas today that are operating and what I would describe as conducting rehearsals, and that won't change. Compound that with the numbers from Air Force and Navy, and this is normal battle rhythm when it comes to providing somebody else to think about what does deterrence look like for what we're doing.
This is for yourself. I threw the question at the Deputy Chief before. So we want to lead by example, and that particularly comes with experience and the more time you serve and the things you get to do. However, there's plenty of situations, myself or for other people that I've seen, that get put into leadership positions or the potential to, and they don't actually have those experiences under their belt, whether that be they haven't done their course yet, they're promoting on posting, or they're just changing their particular day-to-day role. So I was wondering, how would you suggest any particular guidance on how they can still lead and lead well if they don't have those experiences?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And, 39 years in the Army and I'm on my leadership journey. It ain't going to happen overnight. I think that we need to make sure that we understand that your potential has been seen by somebody else. You are never going to see your potential. You are going to step into an environment, you're going to work where you are with what you've got, and you're going to continue to evolve that leadership trait. It was DCA that talked about, your own leadership style. Look at those leaders that are around you, and I'm absolutely going to take some of those traits, probably not going to go near some of those traits, and put them in your kit bag and work out what your leadership style looks like. I think we need to, I'll go back to my point about the training system works. But I get, in order for us to fix some of the hollowness challenges that we have across the organisation, we had to identify people's potential probably earlier than what they would have thought was appropriate. But I could go to CMA and I reckon I could count on one hand how many people have been reduced in rank. So that's a combat indicator right there, that the leadership teams have identified the right people, as difficult as that may be. I was only 4 months into being a corporal when I deployed to Somalia. Medic background, I knew that my medic skills were pretty well squared away after what I was exposed to in that environment. I looked at opportunities and it was a no-brainer. For me to be the best soldier I needed to be, I needed to get experience outside of my ECN. And I talk about, for me to be the best medic I could be, I had to be the best soldier. So it was a no-brainer for me to go to 1RTB. Give back, but also develop my leadership skills as an NCO. And for me, it was the best decision I made. But it's a journey. I would argue that DCA is still on that journey. The Chief is still on that journey. And if you think you've cracked it, you're probably not looking hard enough. So back yourself.
Yeah, so Corporal Callis, 1RTB. Do you believe that the population and the government actually understand the purpose around the culture, warrior culture, and its serious nature of warfare? And if not, how is Defence and the Army assisting in providing guidance to the government and civilian population? Agree with that?
It's a good question. The first thing that comes to mind is, so you're talking particularly about us and our culture and who we are and whether our politicians and Australians understand it. Yep. Yeah. No, look, it's a difficult one. I do think that we as an institution have an obligation to communicate with Australians and let them know who we are and what it is we do. Certainly the Chief's fourth priority is to make sure we tell our story. I think that that's the mechanism to do so. It's a big question though, because in the back of my mind is a thought. To what extent do we need to? Or the assumption behind the question is that Australians don't understand well enough, and I'm not sure that that's true. I mean, they won't understand the detail and so on of what we are, but I think you can pick up enough of a sense of what it is to be a soldier and what soldiers do from watching any number of the popular war films that have come out about Afghanistan and so on. I mean, that recent film Warfare is a classic case. So, it might seem odd that I'm talking about war movies to understand, but most people, I think, have a rudimentary understanding what we exist for. I think most Australians will be able to tell you that I imagine for soldiers to be able to fight well and survive the rigours of the battlefield, there's a certain closeness that you need in your organisation. There's a certain special leadership that they would say, geez, I imagine the Army must give you, on the back of what I was talking about before, suggesting we disappointingly might not do it so well, but the Army must give you some training to make you resilient to sort of the horrors and the challenges and the fear and so on, and complexity of being in contact and so on. I think most people would get that. I think your question really goes to the fact that that the idea of what a soldier is and a warrior is, I'm not sure sometimes we understand it that well, and that's the reason that I did that podcast. That particularly the term. So you know the adage that a soldier is absolutely a warrior. But a soldier is a warrior plus a whole bunch of conditions. For example, that a soldier fights for a nation, has a purpose, is obedient to orders and the instructions of the nation, is responsible to is of the society from which they come from and all of its values and expectations. A warrior doesn't have that. A warrior is simply somebody who fights. And I think where we've got in trouble, and the reason I spoke about it on that podcast, was to sort of remind ourselves of that. Because the idea, it's very easy in military forces for these ideas to start to get skewed in the wrong way. Every vice is a virtue overplayed. And if we forget some of the obligations that come with being a soldier and we focus just what it is on being a warrior, then I think we can lose sight of what is right. Forgive me, there's a lot to your question. There's a lot to answer, but I suppose as I'm answering your question, I think your gut feeling here is right. Sort of some of the stuff I'm even talking about now is probably stuff that we ought to have. It's discussions that we haven't been having with each other, let alone with Australians. So if you ask me, I think we ought to. And in fact, just to give you a sense that we do take your point seriously, we've got at the moment a process to find a suitable company to do a documentary for our 125th birthday year next year that fully has the intention, warts and all, of explaining to Australia what the modern army is, its connection to the past, things that are unchanging about war and battlefields, that helps, I suppose, explain why we are the way we are, to address the very concern for your asking your question, mate. I'm sorry, there's a lot in my answer and I sort of went to and fro, but I think your gut instinct's right, but I just want to make sure that it's not that simple, I don't think. Does that make sense to you? Yeah.
There is a survey that's done every year in regards to institutions, and the Australian Defence Force ranks high on every one of them. So that tells us that we're trusted within society that we serve. But the reason why the Chief chose Army in society is because there's more work we need to do. And you'll hear over the next couple of days from people not only within the system, but also external, because I think that's where the value lies, because we're very biased, institutionalised. So I think in the next 2 days it'll be really advantageous for answering some of those questions which we've all got.
That's excellent. I think that resilience, trust, we talked about readiness in a glance as well, and basically answered the question, which was the contrast between what civil society expects of us, or politicians in your sense, and what the Army achieves. To both of the panellists, RSM and Sir, thank you very much. I'll take 2 minutes for closing comments, but other than that.
Yeah, so I might finish off just to follow on from that discussion. And this is certainly something that we have to remind ourselves, why the Chief has the reflection at the moment on the state of the profession. It is easy for organisations like ours to sort of avoid the hard truths of what we exist for. We spoke about this earlier. Australia has an army because it sees that there's a social need to have an organisation that can fight wars on land, have expertise in knowledge in that subject that nobody else can provide it. We're the only ones, and effectively a licence to kill and maim for policy interests, for the defence of the country and its interests at the direction of the government. Nobody else does that. That's what the army exists for. But at the heart of that is violence. We exist to kill. We succeed in battles because we are better than our enemies at doing that. And that comes with an enormous obligation. For Australians who expect us or to know that we do that on their behalf, then we need to live up, quite rightly, to a higher standard. That's why when we mess up, the public attitude towards us is so much greater than it would be if it was any other organisation, because our business is winning battles, winning wars, and that's a function of violence. I think that's useful, and I do think that that's something that I'm not sure that sometimes we fully appreciate, but I certainly wonder sometimes whether as Australians we appreciate it, and largely, to be frank, as a function of senior leaders. I think it's easy for us to want to avoid some of that hard truth, and it has some challenges when we don't acknowledge it. That's probably the place I'd like to finish.
Just 2 points, if I may. So the first one, we see throughout our history multiple examples of physical courage. But as leaders in a profession, You will be tested morally and have to demonstrate moral courage, probably on a daily basis. And that's okay, providing you take the hard right versus the easy wrong. And then the other point I want to raise is we're here to leave an inheritance, not a legacy. And we have got, certainly in my time in the Army, examples where people have come in and they have done a really good job, and sometimes they have actually been rewarded for that job, but they have left nothing in the tank. The team, the company, the battalion is spent. So I ask you to leave an inheritance, leave the organisation you're in, the job you're in, better than it was before. And that's not to say it was bad before. We are in a different environment. You have a different set of mission and tasks, and you're also looking through it through a different set of eyes. Thanks, sir.
Thanks so much. Cheers.